Rabbinism is found guilty as charged of rewriting the Torah Bible by distorting interpretation in mistranslation. Having missed a paradise takeaway message in Genesis 1:1a Aleph of the humanity Mashiach leadership, it then surmises the alien Messiah Savior. Part 2. The Torah Bible is 100% right, 0% wrong. Rabbinism is 99% right, but 1% wrong. The Torah Bible, coming from before time, is perfection, doesn't age, all else does. But on the other hand, by extending the oral tradition under the umbrella of the oral Torah, Rabbinism claims to be 100% right, 0% wrong. This move is illegitimate by all accounts and measures. The problem with Rabbinism is that it's too oblivious to the brokenness of the world, detached from the urgent need to make it whole as soon as possible before it's too late. Things simply cannot wait for anyone or anything coming from the future. We need to start right away working in present time with the past of the infallible revelation of the Torah teaching at Mount Sinai to Moses. Once identifying the oral tradition as, quote, oral Torah in an usurping move is one small step to further outreach and surmise the Messiah Savior of Messianism. Rabbinism had a choice. Recognize being at a loss as to why the world is still broken, even after revelation of the blueprints of creation and civilization, and keep on searching. But what did they do instead? Not recognize their shortcomings, they went ahead claiming their oral tradition as the, quote, oral Torah. This amounts to saying that there are, quote, two Torahs, or else two half Torahs, a written Torah and an oral Torah. Not completely satisfied, they came up with the insurance policy of offense, surmising messianism of the coming in the indeterminate future of an alien Messiah Savior, with whatever is the case to make our world whole. To clarify this crucial point, let's take a direct look at the respective source biblical text of Deuteronomy 30, verses 12 to 13, as well as a Talmudic tractate, Eruvin, Ritual Enclosures 55a1, commenting on this matter. Herein, the interpretations of Deuteronomy 30, 12 to 13 of three rabbis are compared and contrasted. The question posed is how to interpret the text as to the whereabouts of the Torah Bible, which states, quote, it is not in the heaven, nor is it beyond the sea. Rabbi Avidmi Bar Hama Bar Dosa understand the text as signaling in the sense that if it were actually in the heaven or beyond the sea, then, quote, you would have to ascend after it, and if it were beyond the sea, you would have to cross after it. That's impossible to achieve, thus opening the door to Messianism, since only a Savior can actually accomplish going to heaven and crossing the sea to get a Torah Bible so we can observe it on earth. He mentions the need to derive mnemonics to retain the Torah, which is like today's acronym. The commentator on the other part of the book publisher adds another layer of meaning, interpreting the words of Rabbi Avitmi to mean, quote, one must expend whatever efforts are necessary in order to study the Torah. By contrast, Rabbi Rava understands, quote, not in the heaven, to mean, quote, not to be found in someone who raises his mind over it, like the heavens. He is aggressive to anyone who breaks with the chain of command, those who believe they know more than the teachers of yore. This first part is subjective and the second part objective, mentioning, quote, not found in someone who expands his mind over it like the sea. The commentator further asks, quote, he thinks he knows everything there is to know about the topic he has learned. Lastly, Rabbi Yonahan interprets the first part to mean, quote, not to be found in the haughty, and commented as referring to, quote, those who raise their self-image as though they were in heaven. Regarding the second part, he says, quote, means that it is not to be found among merchants or traders, and further commented to mean referring to those, quote, who are constantly traveling and do not have the time to study the Torah properly. Not in heaven means not, quote, merchants from city to city, nor, quote, peddlers locally selling. All these are subliminal messages, dog whistles, that are only recognized by the doctors of the law of accredited schools. Not too much contact with the outside world. Previous to this, in Eruvim 54:8-2, it references that Torah knowledge should be like a necklace, anakim, worn around the neck, at times showing and at times not, means balancing Torah study with regular work. The truth of the matter is that Rabbinism has failed to make the world whole, plain and simple. The acid test of veracity is success. They use the Torah as trampoline to project their own agenda of messianism. Overreaching, extending their oral tradition to encompass the Torah, Bible, no distinction made whatsoever. It's time for it to be exposed for what it is. For my personal interpretation, I beg the reader to return to the previous episode. Herein, I'll just highlight that the three missed the gist of the text. The first rabbi by insisting that one should pursue it if it were actually in heaven or across the sea, when the actual text is affirming the very opposite to be the case. The second rabbi emphasizes adhering to tradition, meaning following in the footsteps of those rabbis who preceded in teaching. This is clothed in words of humility, condemning personal pride, frowning upon learning directly from the teacher, GD, and circumventing rabbinic agents whose very name means abundance in knowledge. Lastly, the third rabbi coincides in his first part with the second rabbi, condemning haughtiness, but in the second part makes an observation that business is too time-consuming to leave sufficient time for Torah study. This last part resonates, as I can attest from my own personal experience when making infant incubators before receiving the call to continue making them but for the human spirit. What I conclude from this small sample of rabbinic thought as referred to the whereabout of the Torah is that rabbinic vetting tradition plays a major role for better and for worse. Tradition ensures preserving the part they got right. The downside is that it also preserved the part they got wrong or missed, as is the case with the takeaway in Genesis 1:1 Aleph, which is the object of this work of ours. Additionally, it sets boundaries between matters of faith and everything secular, business and sciences affairs, much like the role of the cell in the biology of living things. Herein we employ the Cartesian questioning in order to get to the bottom of things, of why things are broken, even after revelation of the blueprints of civilization. Mischief hides where you least expect it. The devil is both in the details and in missing the big picture view of things, getting lost in details. We need all hands on deck to get through these times and address the pileup of crises. We simply cannot afford the messianism of wait, do nothing, and get in the way of those trying their best to resolve things in present time. Not only has Rabbinism failed to make whole our broken world, I would add that it has contributed in great measure to its breakdown. Having at its disposal the Torah, the blueprints of the social edifice, it needs to be held accountable doubly. Rabbinism is detached from the whole past of revelation, a solution to social edifice for the good life. As an Usi Jew, my angle differed from the rabbis due to my approach route. I must have founded a new school of thought in Judaism, hermeneutics in philosophy, and in faith and science. That makes me a founder. Perhaps this approach may fare better than my ill-fated incursion in politics. The downside is that this is holistic, not of specialty, not generalist, more generalist. The bar is unintentionally set high, requiring Torah study, biblical Hebrew, Kabbalah, philosophy, science, symbolism, politics, and enthusiasm born out of vocation. It is pretty much tailored to my character. I'm not much of a fan of the self-theory of compartmentalization of knowledge. I'm aware that the university works differently, arguing that the information explosion requires quality specialization over rough approximation. Given the premises, the conclusion follows necessarily, without a doubt. The question is regarding the validity of the premise to begin with. This takes us back to what we're addressing herein with the rabbis of the Talmud of the oral tradition as, quote, oral Torah, thus necessarily right by default. The soft part of the argument is that, like in the master key of knowledge, you pretty much have to punt the ball yonder and well beyond reach of a well-rounded education, requiring instead specialization at the price of leaving the rest out. Within this scheme of things, of our awful university without the E, all the while having an awful universe with E, my eclectic, all the while holistic approach falls between the cracks. I'm neither a rabbi nor a scholar, so who am I to dare address this theme? Simply one simply not one satisfied with the rationalization of either Rabbinism or scholarship. The fact is that neither has been able to make whole a broken world with all their apparatus. To me, this not only proves them wrong, they should also be held accountable for the preservation of the breakdown of civilization and of creation. But let's take this meatball one bite at a time, starting with the rabbis of the Talmud, leaving for a later occasion the scholars of the university. Actually, in the previous series of episodes, this topic of scholarship was addressed. In any case, each authority is dominant in its own sphere of influence of thought. Certain landmark events mark off the rabbinic eras, such as the destruction of the Second Temple, the writing of the Talmud, the writing of the Shulchan Aruch, to mention just a few. But more specifically, they are as follows. Sukkot pairs from 200 BCE, before the Common Era, to the beginning of the Common Era. These are paired of scholars as authorities. The last were the schools of Hillel and Shammai. It was followed by the Tanaim teachers from 0 to 230 Common Era. These put down the Mishnah of the oral tradition to writing, the most notable being Yehuda Hanasi, Judah the prince. Then followed the Amoraim, or spokesman, from 230 to 500 Common Era. The problem now was that the Mishnah was very cryptic, hard to understand, since it covered the whole of the oral tradition. Thus, the Gemara became the codified comments on the Mishnah. Today, we find it still too puzzling, which is why it is further commented by the publisher. Next follows the Savoraim, reasoners, from 500 to 630 Common Era. These ones wrote down the Talmud as the Mishnah and Gemara, what is known today as the Halacha, the Walk, or the legal framework of the, quote, oral tradition. Then it was followed by the Gaonim, splendors, from 630 to 1100. This stage continued from Babylonia dominating over Jerusalem. It ended with the fall of the Eastern Empire of Islam and the rise of Islamic Spain and Portugal. The rabbinic sages then moved from Babylonia to Sepharad Spain. Next follows the Rishonim, the first ones, from 1100 to 1500. It started with the transfer of center of learning from Babylonia to Spain, France, and Germany. Ends with the codification of Jewish law in the Shulchan Aruch, the table is set, and the expulsion of Jews from Spain and Portugal in 1492 and 1498. Lastly, the Acharonim, last ones, from 1500 to the present day. From the Shulchan Aruch and expulsion to present times. Well, there have been many thinkers in the last 500 years. Of late, the one who stands out is Rabbi Israel Steinstall, the present commentator of the Bavli Talmud, which we quote here, regarding these three rabbis. An overarching concept in Rabbinism is Yeridat HaDorot, the decline of generations. The idea is that things fade with time, which is evidently true by all measures. The subliminal message is not questioning authority. It is very hierarchical, tiered top down on the outside and growing on the inside. The Yeridat HaDorot applies only to the Nigle, revealed, while the opposite seems to be true regarding the Nistar, the concealed. While the work of Rabbinism is a noble pursuit in its own right, the exegesis of the Torah Bible, it is distant from the concerns of most everybody else, Jewish or otherwise, with how the Torah Bible teaches how to make whole our broken world. Hermeneutics is not an end in itself, as may seem by the focus of rabbinic discussions in the Talmud of the oral tradition. In the meantime, science has gone through the roof, while faith is still grappling with a time switch. But science also has much to blame for the deterioration of the world at both the social and environmental levels, with little, if any, help from the faith quarters. All this courtesy of the chokehold of Messianism, the rabbinic contraption to shield their vulnerability. I am very sorry for not being forgiving after witnessing our crisis-laden age with no end in sight. Everything is idolatry until proven otherwise. Yes, assume guilty until proven not guilty as charged, given the smoking gun conditions in the world. Contrariwise, if we hold on to our sacred item as beyond question, we'll never find the culprit underlying all this mess of civilization. Even question the Torah till we find the key. I didn't, but found it just the same, or more likely, it found me. Rabbinism is guilty as charged of overreach and of consequent distortion for personal and group gain in detriment to all parties involved. There are various layers sedimented into rock-hard fossil. The rabbinic discussion in the Gemara around Deuteronomy 30 verses 12 to 13 found in Eruvin 55a1 is not actually mentioned in the Mishnah from Eruvin 52b5, meaning there's an actual disconnect between the Mishnah generation and that of the sages of the Gemara, and by the look of things from the present Haronim, the last ones. They've been in charge ever since the publication of the Shulchan Aruch Seder table in 1563 Common Era. If Achilles and Goliath had a soft spot, surely Rabbinism does too, as anything having a beginning has a corresponding end. Only the Torah Bible is eternal. All else has expiration date. Well, that's all, people. Yours truly, Rick, your Charro Anusi, Mr. T, GD Bless, Austin, Texas, capital of the world.